Welcome back to Season 6 of the Interwoven podcast. In today's episode, Rebecca and I talk with Ellen Barnard, owner of A Woman's Touch, a sexual health resource center based in Wisconsin that offers education and health products for all ages, gender identities, orientations, and bodies. Ellen has a Master of Science in Social Work and is an ASSECT certified sex educator who has dedicated her career to creating access to carefully curated sexual health education for all. We're grateful to have her in the interwoven space to share her knowledge. We're also grateful to share support with A Woman's Touch this season. Explore the intersection of education and pleasure at A Woman's Touch Sexuality Resource Center. If you are looking to learn more about your sexual health, this educator-owned business is here to help. For more information, check out their website at sexualityresources.com or at their brick-and-mortar shop in Madison, Wisconsin. Thanks for being with us today. Enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Hi, Ellen.
Hi.
Thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Can we get started by having you share your journey into this work and this purpose?
I grew up in a family of intellectuals and readers, and so there was books everywhere. And it is really true that at my grandparents' house there were, Anais Nin and Henry Miller and all the other kind of classic texts. But in my house, there was all kinds of interesting things, and I had a divorced mom, and she was very politically progressive. And so the coffee table often had really interesting books on it. And so I was always looking for something new to read. And one day, this gigantic book showed up, and it was called The Whole Earth Catalog. And it was a collection of excerpts from all of the sort of leftist, progressive, independently produced books that had come out the previous year. And I opened it up, and the page I opened it up to was most notable because it had a naked woman on it. So, naked woman, that's fascinating. Okay, got to read that one. And I started reading it. It was an excerpt from the very first Our Bodies, Ourselves. And the excerpt was all about masturbation. And it went into detail about why it was good for you and how to do it. And of course, I read everything. It was fascinating. And I followed the directions on how to do it and had my very first orgasm. And I am most appreciative of it because it really did start my sexuality journey with my pleasure in my own hands. I didn't think of my pleasure as being somebody else's responsibility. I understood it from that excerpt and from really everything that was in the culture that I was in, that it was my right to be sexual and it was my right to have pleasure. And I want to point out that this was 1972, so long time ago. And I became a peer educator in high school, and I was always the one talking about sex wherever I was working in particular. And I became a social worker. I was working with people with disabilities and older folks, and I was always asking the question, so what about sex and relationships for these folks? Do they get privacy? Are they able to be sexual? Do they need any information? Do they need any support? And so I did that all the way up until I was ready to stop being a social worker. I was burned out and decided, after reading an article in Ms. Magazine about the very new feminist sex shops that were opening up, a couple on the East Coast, a couple on the West Coast, I decided that the Midwest needed its first feminist sex shop, and I was going to open it. I didn't know anything about starting a business, none of that. But I decided it was going to be a place where everybody, women and in particular women, but women and their partners, could go to a shop where they didn't feel shame, where they felt like they could explore and learn and explore pleasure on their own terms, whatever that was, rather than walking into what was then the traditional shop. This is 1996, traditional shop that had porn posters on the wall and DVDs and magazines is the first thing you see, and then boxes depicting all kinds of sex acts for the toys that they were carrying and all that. So that's sex, and sex as other people defined it. And so I decided to offer something very different and ventured into this with a friend of mine who was a doctor. And we opened up a very different kind of sex shop. And it is still a very different kind of sex shop almost 28 years later.
That's amazing. And was your first location in Madison? Was that always the first location, right?
The mothership started here in 1996. We briefly ventured into a location in Milwaukee. We were there for 5 years, but it was too hard to manage 2 locations.
Yeah.
And so even though the store was doing okay, I wasn't. And I couldn't figure out how to hire a manager that really was working as well as we wanted them to with all of the aspects. A friend of mine said to me one day when we were talking about opening a second store, he said, be warned, the store is you and it's about you and it's what you bring to it. So my attempt to try to bring that to Milwaukee meant a lot of traveling and a lot of stress and a lot of work that didn't sustain me enough physically and emotionally to be continued. So that's why the Milwaukee store closed. Not because it wasn't doing well, but because I wasn't doing well trying to
Yeah.
run two shops.
Absolutely. I want to say, though, Teresa and I were just talking about this before we got on the call with you, that I couldn't remember how many years there was a Milwaukee location. But even in other women we have talked to about having this conversation with you, the impact of that store being here for 5 years is great. To this day, so I started practicing acupuncture in 2006. And your brochures are things that I would send to patients or send to your website. I remember like the Still Juicy pamphlet and brochure for women in the menopause transition. And that was, years ago. So I still think about what an amazing resource both the in-person shop and store are and your website are. And so thank you for offering that space, because we were talking about how it must have been so interesting. So we're curious kind of what it was like to open a store and resource center like that when people are used to a different kind of sex shop.
Mm-hmm. We were lucky in Madison in two ways. One is word got out really quickly that there was this different shop that was run by a doctor and a social worker, and the healthcare community in particular heard about it and immediately started sending people in, because the doctors and nurse practitioners had no education in human sexuality, and they knew it, and they didn't really know what to tell people or how to find solutions for them. And so they sent them into us. And so that was an immediate impact on this community here. And then we also were really lucky because I did a couple of free workshops. So I got to put them in the local independent newspaper. And one of the reporters there saw the listings of the workshops and said, "Hey, I want to write a story about your store." And so within the first 6 months, we got some really great publicity pointing out the differences between us and the traditional shops, and why we were here and what we were doing and what experience we wanted this to be for people. So it really, that had a huge impact. And that led to pretty fast success here. Now, in Milwaukee, it was tougher. And that was also part of it. Is it's a bigger community. The dynamics are different. The healthcare community knew about us, but it's so disparate. And you have the problem of Milwaukee folks are spread out quite a bit, and the suburban folks don't like to come downtown, and the people in the city don't necessarily go to the burbs very often. And so we had this issue of people saying, we had a lot of customers through healthcare providers, because we do a lot of outreach to healthcare providers. We send lubricant samples for free and educational brochures like the one you talked about to healthcare providers to give to their patients. But it turned out that most of the providers we were connected to were in the suburbs. And so those folks in Waukesha and Oconomowoc and other places said, "Oh, I never go into the city. It's not safe. I don't like it." And so the population we were hoping would come in and start shopping were reluctant to do so. So it took a lot longer, and it was a lot harder work to get known in the areas where people would come and find us. And they did. It just took a lot longer, and it was a lot more work and a lot more stress. So it took several years for us, even with newspaper articles and stuff, for us to really hit our stride there in terms of the financial success of the business.
Well, and as you said, often as a small business owner, you sort of have to pick your focus and identify who you can best serve and where that is, and how to not spread yourself too thin and get burnt out, right?
Right. Exactly. And that really was the decision, is what do I want to be doing? What can I do? What should I be doing? And all of that really meant that it wasn't feasible to keep two stores open and have the stores be what they needed to be. I still hear from people that they miss the store, and I'm sad about that. But also a lot of people will drive to Madison or do drive to Madison, and so we see them then.
Well, I wanted to touch on the point that when you started this business, it was also at a time where the internet was not the thing that it is today.
Right.
Right. And you have built, at this point, such a valuable resource for people in your website.
Thank you.
People that don't have access to the store in Madison, there's information for sex education that varies from relationships to self-pleasure to intercourse positions to avoid back pain.
Mm-hmm.
products and so much more in the sexuality resource store. I just to let people know, like, you need to go check this out if you have any questions, or like a good starting point for guided education, like sexual health and science, which you break down further into categories like anatomy and function and libido, sexuality and aging, sexuality and cancer. And then the brochures that professionals like Rebecca can tap into and share with their patients.
Yep. Yeah. And that's exactly what I was going to say, is that we have this website. It's a work in progress always, but it is there. There's a ton of information on it. We got online in 1997 before most people did. And our website was really successful in the early days before Amazon and before, now if you do a search in Google for sex toys, you come up with literally a million websites. So we still stand out with the health focus and the education focus. And we're still the most unique. The doctor is no longer with the business, but we're still carrying on with all of that health information and all of the sex and relationship and psychological information that we have put together over the years.
Let's talk about sex toys a little more. Theresa and I
Okay.
were talking about how for both of us, we sort of had a similar, Theresa, I'll let you, both of us were sort of given our first. Yeah.
So, okay, I'll share. In
Okay.
my 20s, I was in a relationship and I knew very little about my body and what gave me pleasure, and that affected our relationship and our sexual health. And so he left me a gift of a vibrator before he left town for a work trip and said, "Get to know your body."
That's great.
And it was one of the best gifts I've ever been given. It was also like permission, like, we have to normalize this. It's okay for you to know your body. But the former Catholic in me, it's like, we don't talk about that stuff.
Right. And I get that a lot here. I talk to people about that all the time, that they're taught that masturbation and self-pleasure and self-exploration is a sin or is wrong, or that you shouldn't do it if you're in a relationship. It should be up to your partner to provide you with pleasure or help, or somehow figure out what you like, even if you don't know, which isn't reasonable, right? No matter who or what your partner is in terms of gender identity, experience, all of that, nobody is inside of your body but you. And so nobody can know your body and mind. I mean, I'm working on it. Funny, like, part of what's going on for me right now, and the reason I feel a little bit harried, is I'm putting together, or I'm adding to a presentation that I'm going to do next week for a sex therapy institute on sex and neurodivergence, and how being neurodivergent impacts people's sex and relationships. And one of the things that I realized at 4:00 this morning when I was thinking about it, which is how I go, a lot of us are like that. We wake up and do our best work at 4 a.m, was that it's still all about, you have to know yourself. You have to know your own brain and what works for it. You have to know your body. And it is a mind-body relationship. And you have to explore all of that in order for you to share that with someone so that they can be a part of the experience of exchanging energy and touch and pleasure, so that it's satisfying for both of you. And if you don't know that, how are they going to know that? Except for hit or miss, right? You might have a partner who pays a lot of attention and is really astute, but that's not many partners. And especially if your partner is also experiencing their own pleasure at the same time, right? One of the things I learned early on, as I worked with a lot of different types of people, is that heterosexual couples have some struggles that are unique, in that, for the most part, both of them are trying to experience intense pleasure at the same time. And the issue with that is, how do you enjoy and feel your own pleasure, but also pay attention to what's going on for your partner? Mm-hmm. And that's hard. I mean, that's a big, it's a lot to pay attention to, right? And staying present with both your own sensations and your partner's experience is not easy. And so I learned that teaching people how to take turns, and quite honestly, this is something that the lesbian community does a lot, take turns, means that one person is getting to receive and experience all of this touch and pleasure, and the other person can pay attention to what's working and what's really pushing their buttons in the right ways, and can say, "Ooh, I just noticed that you really like this, so I'm going to do it more," and not be distracted by what's going on in their bodies and minds for their own pleasure. And I think that that's something that I have brought to teaching people, no matter who they're with, is I often suggest back away from things like intercourse for a while and do each other, so that you can pay attention to what the person that you're with enjoys in terms of kind of touch, places for touch, intensity of touch, speed, what kinds of stuff makes their minds go poof in terms of words or positions or whatever, fantasy play, so that you can bring that into your play and then see what it's like to be mutual and bring that all, yeah, right? And then that's that incredible experience.
Because that's where the mindfulness comes from that keeps you present.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the connection with your
Right.
partner when you're in that. Because what we're shown is two people climaxing at the same time. They both feel great and they both fall back and, end of story.
Right. That is right. That's the classic romance novel, movie, scene, whatever. Right.
Yeah.
And that each, well, usually if it's heterosexual, that the man knows exactly what the woman wants.
Mhm.
And it's fantastic from the minute it starts. When that's just not true. New partners take time. And it takes a while to learn somebody else's body and mind and what works for them. And so it is not fair, in fact, to expect a partner to know what you like until they have a chance to learn that, or until you say it. One of the other things that I have learned over the years is that people in the kink community are really good at communicating all of the things, both the things that they don't like and don't want, and the things that they enjoy and do want. And they do that before they start engaging with a partner. Whereas folks who don't identify that way and aren't playing with what some people could consider more risky behaviors or more challenging, more, things that require planning and care, we don't do that. So we don't go and sit down with somebody and say, okay, so these are the things that are off the table. Don't even think about it. These are the things I'm curious about, but I've never done. So maybe. And these are the things that I know I love about my body and mind, and how you can offer me pleasure, and however I define that, in a way that's really going to work for me. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from those communities in terms of consent, communication, negotiation. And I have seen that. I have gone to workshops around that and watched how well it works for people and the successes that they get from those early conversations before they're ever touching. Whereas what we usually, what we kind of grow up with in this culture is we meet somebody, there's a spark, we're really attracted, we start touching, we get carried away in the moment, and we let it happen. And we don't even really learn very well how to negotiate around safer sex. Mm-hmm. And what kinds of things, like what you love, what you don't love, like the no-go places, right? That informed and deep and enthusiastic consent requires that you know yourself and that you can say, yes, this is fine. Yes, this is fine. Yes, this is fine. No, actually, this isn't working for me, right? But that's not something that's easy for people at all. And we're not taught the skills for it, even though we ask people to do that.
I feel like I'm like like my mind is just, that all makes such perfect sense. And it's frustrating that we aren't taught that, because there's so much pressure in the other way of looking at it, right? It's like there has to be, like you said, this spark, and it's like everything just is in sync, right? It's what the movies show, but that's not reality. And we change, our partners change. And somehow I think it seems like there's this idea that talking about it makes it not so sexy, but really we've kind of mentioned a couple of times, like that permission to go deeper with your partner or whoever you're engaging with, to get to know yourself better. But also, it actually seems like it is way more sexy, that it has so much more potential to be so much more fulfilling.
Yeah. And part of this is because our culture has so much shame around sex, right? So it's not sexy to talk about because it tends to bring up a lot of shame and embarrassment and discomfort. And because we don't grow up being taught how to talk about it, right? I often think about the fact that we put people through driver's ed, but we don't really put people through a functional sex education for the most part. And yet it is just as important. And it is just as important to learn how to say yes and no and navigate the complexities of bodies and minds and safety and permissions and pleasure as it is to learn how to drive a car successfully or anything else that we learn how to do. And unfortunately, our culture that's mostly built on shame, you brought up, your Catholic upbringing, and that's some version of that is what many people in this country grow up with. And then, we now have a lot of schools that really can't even teach sex education of any kind or help people explore themselves, their identities, or their bodies. So you're left to, either learn from friends, the internet, porn, movies, books, right? Romances. Romances are not a great way. And so that's it. That's what you have, right? There's nothing else. And that's hard. That's really hard. And so figuring out how to learn and how to strip away the cultural messages that you internalized and then start creating your own version of what is sexuality for you from the inside is the sexiest thing you can do. And I've certainly learned that over the years. As I've helped people explore things like being friends with benefits or hookups, that requires a great deal of skill if you want it to be something that's actually enjoyable, right? There's a lot of conversation about the orgasm gap between cis-het women and cis-het men, and that most heterosexual women don't have orgasms during play with new heterosexual partners. It's like 39% have orgasms, whereas lesbians, 83% have orgasms when they're first sexual with their new partners. And some of that's because of the turn taking, and at least it's a somewhat familiar body type, maybe, depending. I mean, everybody's different and should be and are. But the reason we have the orgasm gap is because we aren't given permission to say, this is what I like, this is how I like it, this is what I need to get off. I have a vibrator. I would like to use it when we play. Okay. And the other person can say yes or no. And that's, that's a fairly simple conversation, but it's so hard to do, right? And it takes practice. And where are we going to practice it? We can practice it with our partners, but we're afraid to. We're afraid to be judged. We're afraid, we get embarrassed, we get uncomfortable. And somehow we have to give ourselves permission to work through all of that, find the ways to practice it, find the things you want to say, write it down if you need to. We actually have a little handout in the store that is things to consider when you have a new sex partner. And it includes things like information you want to share with them about both STIs and STI testing and safer sex supplies, but then also the things you like and need and want in an exchange, in an interaction, because we realized that people wanted a little checklist that they could use. It helps, but not everybody has access to that.
And we'll be right back. Explore the intersection of education and pleasure at a Woman's Touch Sexuality Resource Center. If you are looking to learn more about your sexual health or pleasure, this educator-owned business is here to help. A Woman's Touch bases all their education in current sex science and a deep understanding of the mind-body connection. Their tasteful, pleasure-focused shop and website offer education and products to help after a baby, or heading off on your honeymoon, during or post-menopause or cancer, or spicing up a long-term relationship. For more information, check out their website at sexualityresources.com or at their brick-and-mortar shop in Madison, Wisconsin. You've clearly been doing this for a long time because you're like checking off all my questions very seamlessly.
I think it is really true that I've been talking about this topic a long time. And I love this particular kind of conversation about communication and getting what you want and learning how to ask for what you want and getting comfortable with that and recognizing where your discomfort comes from, working on undoing the shameful messages that are coming from somewhere not you, right? From your past, from your parents, from the culture, from who knows what, right? And then figuring out how to be right here with yourself and advocating for your needs, wants, and desires without that shame and without embarrassment. And clear enough that your partner or partners can know what you want so they know how to make sure it works for you.
This area seems varied and collaborative. What sort of a network do you have to help support people? Like who's in your roster of professionals to help people along in their journeys?
It's a tough question. I mean, there are sex educators and there are sex coaches out there, and there are it's a changing area and a changing field. So I can't, I have some people I always send people to, but then it depends on who you are and what you need. There are sex therapists out there for people who are struggling really deeply with things that they can't figure out how to address, or issues when they're in a partnership where you really can't figure out how to communicate and how to develop the tools that you need to have both romantic relationship or all of them, romantic relationship and sexual conversations that lead to success and comfort. I get as many questions about pain and discomfort as anything. I do definitely get to talk to people about other topics, but because of the nature of this particular business, I get a lot of folks in who either have never had orgasms or have painful penetration, or if they have penises, who struggle with their erections and getting them and keeping them. So I get a lot more of the health-related and functional questions, and I have a huge network of pelvic floor therapists and healthcare providers and books that are available for those folks. And there's some really good books now for helping people learn both what they like and then how to communicate about what they like and want, depending on the situation, for sure.
Do you have any?
I hesitate to recommend things like websites and TikToks because the information's all over the map. For teenagers, I love Scarleteen. It's probably the best, and really teenagers and people in their 20s. It's one of the best informational websites I've ever seen to help people navigate these communication questions, consent questions, learning about themselves and their bodies. It's a great organization, and it's a great website to get all the basics.
What was that website again?
Scarleteen.
I made
Been around a really long time.
Okay, great.
I know we want to touch on at some point about, in our community, we have women who are experiencing postpartum, peri, and menopause, and those times of change. Rebecca, do you want to ask that point, or?
Yeah, I guess one thing that just popped up sort of in relation to that is maybe, you mentioned kind of the pain piece already, but as far as sort of women who are postpartum or in perimenopause or menopause, are there some things that you see sort of more specific to that are coming through your website or into the store? I know you mentioned lubrication. Certainly, I'm guessing that that's an important piece of the puzzle. Yeah, maybe if you could just share a bit more on what you see kind of with women in those transitions.
Yeah. So definitely for people who are postpartum, there are a couple of challenges. Some of them are about physical and some about psychological changes. And I often spend time, before COVID, you changed everybody's lives so much. I used to go to these pregnancy groups, so pre-birth groups, as well as these postpartum groups, folks who had little babies, really new babies, and talk about pregnancy, postpartum, and sexuality, and talk about the fact that your brain changes, first of all, and to really give people permission to understand that the brain changes and that you shouldn't expect yourself to be sexual in the way you used to be. Your brain, quite honestly, needs to pay attention to the baby for quite a while at first, and that's fine. That's what you're supposed to do. I mean, evolutionarily, you're not supposed to get pregnant right away. So you're supposed to attend to this completely helpless being. And so sexual desire really kind of goes to the side at that point in time. And that's normal. And it comes back as you are able to let down your subconscious guard, right? It's not even your conscious mind. It's your unconscious mind that's always listening for the baby. And some people aren't affected by that, but most people are. I had some friends who had a new baby, and they were just such sexual people that it didn't matter. They just started being sexual after 12 weeks, no matter what, because they really needed that, wanted that, and that was important to them. But that's not common. And I like to give people permission to say, it'll take the time it takes. It'll take the time I need and baby needs for me to trust that I know what those sounds mean and what's going on and what the rhythms are, and actually to develop rhythms of sleep and wake and feeding and changing so that you can actually have spaces that you can rely on mostly, where you can actually let down and be present with your body and your partner and not just listen for the baby. So that's the first thing I always talk about. And then the other thing I talk about is if you're breastfeeding, you will have very significant changes in your arousal and in your self-lubrication process, because breastfeeding suppresses some of the hormones that facilitate lubrication and vaginal lubrication in particular, but also that facilitate blood flow to your genitals in a way that allows you to feel arousal quickly and understand that your body's ready for sex. And so adding a really good lubricant to the mix makes a huge difference in comfort and in addressing the dryness that happens. And, a lot of folks aren't told that it's related to their breastfeeding. And so they don't understand and they think there's something wrong, or their partner thinks there's something wrong when they're dry, even though they're turned on and interested. So lubricant's always an important addition. And it's honestly a good addition for many people, unless they're really, really wet. And sometimes people are too wet. So that's another conversation. Same thing starts happening, right, with perimenopause and postmenopause, right? So estrogen recedes in the body. And I want to address the fact that some people go into instant menopause when they have their ovaries removed, if they have that for a variety of reasons, often because of cancer. And when you remove the ovaries, essentially most of the source of your estrogen other than your body fat is immediately removed. And so you generally crash through menopause pretty quickly. We like to call it instant menopause here. What estrogen does for us is estrogen facilitates blood flow. So it facilitates blood flow all over our bodies. It's one of the reasons why strength training is so important after menopause, because our muscles aren't getting as much blood flow. And so they lose their strength, their tissues literally change. It's also true that you don't produce your own lubrication as easily. And what vaginal lubrication is just blood flow to the vaginal walls that squeezes fluid through these teeny, teeny gaps. And that's what creates vaginal lubrication. So when you don't get fast blood flow when you're getting aroused, you don't get lubrication. It also means that the vaginal skin starts thinning because it doesn't turn over. So our skin's supposed to slough off and we grow new skin cells and they're thicker and more happy and they protect us more effectively. And when we go through menopause, that stops happening, and particularly on the vulva and the vagina, so that you get dead skin cells building up that can start being very fragile and tearing, which then causes micro tears and scar tissue, and some pain due to the skin being thin and being dry. The other thing that often happens is you're not getting blood flow to the pelvic floor muscles that surround the vagina and hold up your uterus and close your urethra so you don't leak urine. And because you don't get fast blood flow to those muscles, when you exercise your muscles and contract them during any kinds of activities like running, weight training, yoga, those muscles can get tight and not relax again because they don't get enough blood flow to let them relax. Muscles need blood flow to relax and to have their full range of motion. And so a common source of pain for women after menopause or during menopause transition is one or more of their pelvic floor muscles getting tight and not relaxing. And then their partner hits that muscle during penetration, or they hit that muscle during some kind of play, and it hurts. And when you start having pain, your body tightens up and defends, and it's going to hurt more, and the muscles get tighter, and you end up in this cycle where everything gets difficult. That's when I send people to pelvic floor physical therapy, because pelvic floor physical therapists are there, physical or occupational therapists really are there to help work with your pelvic floor and get it moving so that it is both strong and flexible. On the other side of it is if you've had a few babies or one baby and it was, carried a heavy pregnancy, your pelvic floor muscles can get stretched out. And if you don't exercise them correctly after pregnancy, right? In Europe, they have the 4th trimester where people are encouraged to get pelvic floor therapy after they give birth. I wish we did that here automatically.
Yes.
But when people don't do that, then they end up with weak pelvic floor muscles. When you have a weak pelvic floor, you don't feel your orgasms as well because the muscles cannot contract and relax with a big, strong range of motion. And orgasms are just the contracting and relaxing of the pelvic floor muscles. And so sometimes people will come into me and they'll say, I get all aroused and everything's going great. And then it all disappears. And I'm not aroused anymore, but I didn't feel anything. And that's when they have orgasms that they don't feel because their muscles are too weak. Again, great referral for pelvic floor therapy. And all of that is part of what we do on a almost daily basis. We have a pelvic floor health brochure for all people because pelvic floor health is critical to everybody. And it's important to help people with penises hold their erections. It's important for orgasmic health. It's important for comfortable penetration. And so teaching people how to do pelvic floor exercises correctly is really important to us. And that addresses some of the pain issues that we see. There are a lot of others. That's a whole other conversation. But, that's kind of what we do here is a lot of that. And we developed a protocol for maintaining vaginal and vulvar health through and beyond menopause, or after cancer treatment where people are on estrogen blockers, or after cancer treatment where they get radiation therapy. And we developed a whole program and protocol that we developed it 25 years ago, and that now many healthcare providers send people to us for the supplies for. We developed a medical device to help facilitate that program. We also have lubricants that we recommend specifically for that aspect of the program of adding moisture and facilitating skin health. And that is one of the things that people often find us for. When people are searching on the web, that's often how they come across us, is because we have all of that information for really good sex after menopause.
That's great.
I think you may have touched on this before when you were talking about partners and taking time together, but I just wanted to touch on mismatched libidos. That also seems to be something in our age group in the interwoven community that topic comes up a decent amount.
Yeah. And libido's complicated. Libido is a mind-body thing also, right? So libido, technically, desire starts in your brain. But we grow up in a culture that teaches us that the signs that we're interested in sex come from our body, right? You feel horny. You feel a tingle. You get this little whatever. You think about sex and you feel it in your vulva, or if you're somebody with a penis, you think about sex and you get hard. And that changes over time. It changes maybe because you're paying attention to other things, or because you have stress, or you're distracted. It also changes when you're getting older and you don't have the fast blood flow that you used to have. You need that fast blood flow to be aware of arousal in your body. And when that doesn't happen, it's still happening, but it's so subtle you don't notice it. And so sometimes libido is literally about somebody who's perimenopausal or post, and they no longer feel the physical drive to be sexual, and they don't realize that they can use their brains to kickstart the process of erotic connection and start doing the activities that feel good. It has to feel good, because the other part of this is, if it hurts, your brain's going to shut your libido off in a heartbeat. And it's going to say, oh, not going to let you do anything that hurts. So that means I'm not going to want it. And so we have to make sure that there's no pain. And then we also have to make sure that it's pleasurable and fun. And once we know that, then we can say, okay, let's make a sex date. Let's send each other erotic texts all day so that we're ready when we meet. And I've actually started priming the pump of my body, right? Because it takes that long for some people. It also means using tools like lubricants and vibrators, and communicating with your partner about what's changed and what you need. It's also true that everybody's different in how much they want sex. So some of us have high libidos our whole lives, and it's a priority. Some of us have really low libidos, but when we're falling in love, or when we're really, in sync with our partner and things are really moving, then we start feeling more interested and desiring. But oftentimes people are not necessarily paired with people who have a similar libido and similar levels of desire in the first place. And then when life happens and bodies change and things hurt and things, we have stress and distractions, it exacerbates the issue. The reason many people go to see sex therapists is because there is a discrepancy in desire between the two people, and they need to figure out how to manage that. And for many people, it is a doable thing to figure out how to manage it, but it takes communication. It takes self-knowledge. It takes the willingness not to just say sex should be spontaneous, but I can plan for sex. I can make sex happen, and I can make it be great. I can use the tools that make it more fun. I can use fantasies. I can read books. We can do all kinds of things to get the brain part of us in the game, and then the tools to bring our body online and enjoying it in ways that are deeply pleasurable. But again, right, we don't get taught that we can be deliberate about sex. It's supposed to be spontaneous and magical when it happens. And it should spontaneously happen often. And life gets less and less spontaneous as we get older and have jobs and kids and things that take our brains away.
It's true. And then there's a stigma on the scheduling sex, that there's something that's undesirable and unsexy about that.
It's not sexy, right? Yeah. It's not sexy, but actually it's really sexy. Are you kidding?
Yeah, the brain activates then, and you are thinking about it. And
And flirting sexting, buying something that makes you feel sexy, whether it's real, whether it's lingerie or something else, and teasing your partner with that idea. Just wait until we guess what I have planned. I bet you can't guess. There's so many ways to be flirtatious and inviting that gets the head going, and it's much sexier then. It's so much more fun when you're actually like being erotically engaged through the week or through the day. And it's a little naughty, which is really fun, right? If you can get past the fact that you're not supposed to be naughty.
I have enjoyed this. I've appreciated this conversation so much. Rebecca, do you have anything to cover before we jump to the thread question?
No, I feel like I could just sit and listen for hours. It has been such a great conversation, and I'm so grateful that we were able to connect with you, and look forward to continuing to delve into the information on your website. And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I love this, obviously. You can tell. It's my favorite place to be. All right, so your thread question.
Yes. Can you describe a time when you felt totally alive?
I laugh because for the most part, I feel totally alive most of the time. And for me, it is really true that really amazing sex is the time that I feel totally alive. And I will be honest and say it only happened episodically up until recently, because I have not chosen partners who were nearly as adventurous and interested in all kinds of aspects of sexuality. And now I have partners who are adventurous and love to communicate and love to be very naughty and very frisky, and have had the pleasure of being able to enjoy sex that keeps every inch of my mind and body focused on what's happening and fully just firing on all cylinders and fully alive the whole time. And sometimes for a very long time, which is amazing. So I am absolutely a proponent of talking about what you like and want, being okay about planning it, being okay about asking for whatever tools you need to make it happen and make it be amazing, using fantasy, not necessarily living out fantasies, some fantasies, yes, but not all, but really bring that to the game and just give yourself permission to be 100% embodied. And when I am there, and it is one of the 2 times in my life, when I do yoga is the other time I'm completely embodied. But for me, it's really, sex is the way it turns my head off. It makes me feel fully in my body and fully alive in my body in a way that nothing else ever does.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Awesome. Awesome, Ellen. Thank you so much for being here. This has been a great conversation, and I hope that people who listen feel inspired to take some time with themselves to think about what matters to them and what they want and what they need.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for joining us today in the Interwoven space. We invite you to give us a star review and to hit subscribe for a new empowering conversation each week. Visit our website for more of our resources, health guides, podcast episodes, and more at www.interwoven.com. That's interwovxn.com. With this project, we are creating space for women to share their stories. It is not meant to diagnose or treat a medical condition. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding your health and well-being. Special thanks to Gina Barrington for providing the interwoven music. Until next time.